Since the dawn of cinema, audiences have always loved one key thing. Doesn't matter how old you are, doesn't matter when you were born, doesn't matter what generation you're from. Everyone loves watching giant monsters tear apart a building, ripping a street up from its roots, smashing another monster's face into another building, causing absolute pandemonium. And really, I mean from the start of cinema, we always liked something big rushing at the camera. There's that famous story about the 1896 film, The Arrival of a Train, which just features a train coming into a station, and yet stories persist that when that film was first debuted, audiences leapt out of the way to avoid the train coming at them. Whether or not that's true or just anecdotal, who really knows? But it would take filmmakers a few more years to ever come up with something that effective again. The Lost World. The Lost World is an adaptation of the novel of the same name by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Doyle, of course, being the famed creator of Sherlock Holmes and believer in fairies. In it, adventurers explore an undiscovered plateau that exists in South America. Upon this plateau, which is isolated from the rest of the world, prehistoric life and cavemen still walk the earth. Side by side, apparently. Willis O'Brien's stop-motion effects helped bring dinosaurs back from extinction and onto the silver screen for the first time. Well, the first time not counting that one animated short that was popular in the 1910s. But the film ends with a brontosaurus being brought back by the adventurers to London. This was a deviation from the book, but what this deviation did was bring a giant monster into the then modern day, allowing destruction to reign supreme. And this, of course, was just a warm-up act. Not for London, of course. It would take several decades before another monster came to London to wreck stuff up, but it became a precedent for filmmakers. If you want to have a really cool finale, bring a dinosaur into a city and have it wreck up stuff. Or a giant gorilla. Or some giant undetermined prehistoric creature from before the dawn of time itself. Willis O'Brien would, of course, top himself in 1933 with King Kong, the first major kaiju film in cinematic history. But after King Kong came a lesser-known film, which started a rivalry which continues to this very day. 1938, Japan released its response to King Kong. King Kong appears in Edo, Japan's first kaiju film. And while this lost film may be impossible to see today, it is impossible to understate how this begins the conversation between the East and West about giant monsters. Giant monsters are a major part of the film industry, and I think a lot of the discussions of film history can always come back to these giant monster films. Now, personally, some of my earliest memories were watching the Sci-Fi Channel with my grandmother, who would just have it on the TV when I was there. And on the channel, you see these reruns of old classic monster films.
Godzilla is approaching. Evacuate immediately.
Sci-Fi Stumpathon 2001 continues next with Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, only on Sci-Fi.
And at the time, you don't know what the difference between a Japanese and a European monster film is. Tarantula, Mothra, what does it really matter at the time? Though, as you get older, you realize you might have fallen asleep during one too many scenes of identical white men in white shirts talking about a monster to remember that the movie doesn't really feature a whole lot of the monster. I mean, look, Tarantula especially. I mean, I'm just saying, that Tarantula only shows up for the last 15 minutes, and you have enough time for the Tarantula to walk around in a superimposed background. But, like, your average Godzilla film has, like, 4 or 5 major scenes throughout the movie where Godzilla wrecks stuff up. Tarantula, you gotta wait for most of the movie. I'm just saying, rewatching Tarantula was a very disappointing experience, and I'm still upset by that. But when you look at Rotten Tomatoes, Universal Pictures' Tarantula has a 93% Rotten Tomatoes, and is considered a culturally significant entry in the Western sci-fi horror genre.
Tonight, we're training our microscopes on the world of science, and more precisely, experiments gone wrong. First up is one of my absolute favorites, tarantula. Using real tarantula footage effectively transposed to mammoth proportions, with a combination of miniatures and effects, especially in the many sequences smartly set off in the dead of night, as well as the creepy makeup depicting the various humans afflicted with acromegaly. Tarantula is a true gem.
Yet King Kong vs. Godzilla has about 52% of Rotten Tomatoes. King Kong vs. Godzilla is way more culturally significant, I always thought, than Tarantula. More people know about it, more people clamoring for it to get remade, people place bets on it, there were rumors about its ending for many, many years. Yet, Tarantula is seen as the more culturally significant film in a critical landscape. When King Kong vs. Godzilla first came out in America, it was re-edited. A lot of the themes and ideas were taken out of the film.
While the US version stays on the scene to the end, the Japanese version cuts away from it to a studio recording what looks to be a commercial. This is also where we're introduced to our main lead, Osamu Sakurai, played by Taruo Takashima, though this entire moment is removed in the US version.
The movie itself is a satire on television, on marketing, on advertising. It is, in film, a WWE match, essentially. And yet in America, they cut out the social satire to make the Japanese people look really silly and replace all the scenes of satire with boring white men in suits talking about who could win, about the monsters, discussing the science behind it that makes no sense if you have any passing knowledge of science. And that's kind of weird, right? Why would America deliberately take a film about social satire and make it a boring, generic, bland entry in the monster genre? And maybe it's because America didn't want Japan to really totally reinterpret one of their monsters. Like King Kong, America doesn't have many exports. King Kong is one of the few purely American exports that we have. And ironically, it's a film about Americans going to someone else's territory and taking something that belongs to them and bringing it back to us. Kind of a taste of irony, isn't it? That someone else took our American export, quote unquote, that was really us stealing a monster from somewhere else, and then us getting pissy about it and re-editing their film to better reflect our beasts and our style. Kind of funny, isn't it? But nowadays, people look at stuff like Shin Godzilla and Godzilla Minus One and go, well, Japan, that's Kaiju Central. You want a good Kaiju film, go Japan. And nowadays, the American Kaiju film is seen as the lesser product, whereas in the 60s and 50s, the Japanese Kaiju was underrated, underappreciated. The 70s, 80s, same thing. In fact, most Godzilla films were not even given a VHS release after the 80s. The old ones were, but the Heisei era Godzilla films couldn't watch them. It is widely believed now that the reason Godzilla films were no longer distributed during the 90s is due to a controversy involving the film Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah.
He's currently starring in his 18th film, and as Taylor Henry reports, the plotline has stirred up a bit of controversy.
In Japan's latest Godzilla movie, this is the great showdown. Godzilla taking on the three-headed monster, King Ghidorah. In the process, Godzilla trashes Tokyo's opulent new 48-story City Hall, cynically known among the public here as the Tax Tower. The destruction comes much to the delight of Japanese moviegoers. But some might regard the plot of the movie, released December 14th in Japan, as anti-US. Time travelers arrive in UFOs from the 23rd century. Japan, they say, will rise to become the world's greatest power, only to be destroyed by Godzilla. Godzilla, once a dinosaur friendly to Japan, the movie explains, helped Japanese defeat Americans in a World War II Pacific battle. Director Kazuki Amori says this appeal to the Japanese survival instinct is not meant to be anti-American.
The movie is not especially anti-US. I just thought I'd try to picture the identity of the Japanese people.
As a result of this, distributors didn't want to touch this era of Godzilla films. It wasn't until Godzilla 2000 that a Japanese Godzilla film was distributed in the West again. Gamera, forget it. If you go outside of the main Godzilla branch of films, it was very hard to find copies of these films distributed in Western markets. So it's become a very interesting conversation. East versus West. King Kong versus Godzilla, with both countries creating monsters and both countries reinterpreting said monsters through a new lens. It's a conversation about film, but it's also a conversation about our deep-seated fears, what we are fascinated by, and what captures the imaginations of us moving forward through time. It's undeniable that there's a bias in how Western monster films are made, or for the most part how they are made. and how critics discuss Western monster films, again, for the most part. None of this is all-encompassing, but you can't help but see a few trends develop over time. How do critics talk about Western giant monsters versus Eastern giant monsters? How is King Kong discussed in critical circles differently than Godzilla?
On good days, I consider Citizen Kane the seminal film of the sound era, but on bad days, it is King Kong. That is not to say I dislike King Kong, which, in this age of technical perfection, uses its very naivety to generate a kind of creepy awe. It's simply to observe that this low-rent monster movie, and not the psychological puzzle of Kane, pointed the way toward the current era of special effects, science fiction, cataclysmic destruction, and non-stop shocks. King Kong is the father of Jurassic Park, the Alien movies, and countless other stories in which heroes are terrified by skillful special effects. A movie like Silence of the Lambs, which finds its evil in a man's personality, seems humanistic by contrast.
In the 50s, the American producer Joseph E. Levin bought the Japanese film, cut it by 40 minutes, removed all of the political content, and awkwardly inserted Burr into scenes where he clearly did not fit. The hapless actor gives us reaction shots where he's looking in the wrong direction, listens to Japanese actors dubbed into the American idiom. They always call him Steve Martin, or even the famous Steve Martin, and provides a reassuring conclusion in which Godzilla is seen as some kind of public health problem, or maybe just a malcontent.
But King Kong is more than a technical achievement. It's also a curiously touching fable in which the beast is seen not as a monster of destruction, but as a creature that in its own way wants to do the right thing.
In these days of flawless special effects, Godzilla and the city he destroys are equally crude. Godzilla at times looks uncannily like a man in a lizard suit, stomping on cardboard sets, as indeed he was, and did. Other scenes show him as a stuffed, awkward animatronic model. This was not state-of-the-art even at the time. King Kong 1933 was much more convincing.
Unlike the extraterrestrial spiders in the Alien pictures, which embody single-minded aggression, Kong cares for his captive human female, protects her, attacks only when provoked, and would be perfectly happy to be left alone on his specific island. It is the greed of a Hollywood showman that unleashes Kong's rage. And anyone who thinks to exhibit the beast on a New York stage in front of a live audience deserves what he gets. Indeed, more than he gets.
This is a bad movie, but it has earned its place in history, and the enduring popularity of Godzilla and other monsters shows that it struck a chord.
Even allowing for its slow start, wooden acting, and wall-to-wall screaming, there is something ageless and primeval about King Kong that still somehow works.
With almost a century since The Lost World came out, all of it's on the table. There's a lot of films we're just going to make big, broad statements about. Because, again, we can't talk about every single giant monster film of all time. There's going to be 1,000 that you can think of. I'm not going to mention the North Korean kaiju film.
In 1978, famous South Korean director Shin Sang-uk and his wife Choi Eun-hee were abducted by the North Korean government. For the next 8 years, they were forced to make propaganda films. Until 1986, where they finally managed to escape to the US. One such propaganda film is 1985's Pulgasari, a giant monster film produced by Kim Jong-il.
I'm not going to talk about The Giant Claw, a film that was so bad the lead actors after the premiere went to the bar to get drunk. No, I can't talk about them all because there's so many films. But what I can talk about are the broad strokes throughout history. What fears are represented? What ideas are presented? And what did this say about our individual countries and the cross-cultural exchange between America and Japan and the surrounding countries around them? Let's start. So let's look at the first couple of true monster films, The Lost World and King Kong. Both focus on isolated environments where dinosaurs and megafauna are allowed to proliferate with minimal interference from the modern man. And this overlaps a lot with old adventure serials. It has more in common with Edgar Rice Burroughs or even Lovecraft than anything else, of some undiscovered thing, unlike anything we've seen before. But ultimately, nature. It is nature that we have untapped, not a human culture, not some ancient civilization, but the untapped limitations and extensions of nature itself. And honestly, there is some real life backing for this idea. At the time, people had still not explored every part of the map yet, and adventurers would travel to places unknown at their own peril. John Franklin's doomed voyage to the Northwest Passage, a route that went north of Britain, Greenland, and Canada, led ultimately to the deaths of an entire crew of sailors. That story was recounted in the show The Terror, if that sounds familiar to you. Explorers spoke of dragons on the island of Komodo, and ape-men in the heart of the Congo. Now, of course, we know these to just be undiscovered animals, but this stuff captured the imagination. Like, what else was there that we didn't know? And I know I mentioned Lovecraft, but let's put him aside for a second. Most of these monsters weren't beyond human comprehension. They weren't Cthulhu. They were just really big things that we already knew about to some extent. Dinosaurs, giant apes, maybe not tentacled elder gods, but they were sort of these unbelievable things that boggled the mind. Their function in the story was essentially twofold. One, it forced man to go somewhere they had not yet colonized. And two, it made people vulnerable. They were out of their element. They were now at a place where they could be equalized with nature, where their guns and their arsenal were no longer all that helpful, where battleships could not travel. And our arrogance for thinking that we could conquer this thing, it would always lead to destruction of our own cities. We could bring it back. We could bring a brontosaurus back with us. We could bring a giant ape back with us, and it would just blow up in our face. Now, what's interesting is that if you watch these old films, the animals are still treated ultimately like animals. King Kong, while humanized in later adaptations, is still a great ape here. He acts instinctually. His motives are reasonable. They're simple but reasonable. And he's ultimately just a giant creature who was the apex predator in his area, brought somewhere else. It's entirely fantasy. I think Mighty Joe Young, which came out like a decade or so later, is another really great example of Willis O'Brien special effects and some great examples where monsters would kind of go in some extent, where these more humanoid monsters would be humanized, treated sympathetically directly in the narrative of the plot. King Kong is still sympathetic in the film, yes, but not to the same extent that he is directly empathized with by the audience and director as Mighty Joe Young is in his film.
See Mighty Joe Young, enraged by Hollywood pranksters, destroy Filmland's swankiest nightclub on a fabulous Sunset Strip.
But by that point, we had kind of seen that play out before. It's also worth noting that around the same time as King Kong came out, there were accounts such as the Loch Ness Monster. You know, Loch Ness Monster, that was always accounted for to some extent. There was always legends of something there, but the first account of this long-necked creature living in Loch Ness came from a couple who had just left a screening of King Kong. Yeah, look it up. It's telling. 1933, that's when Loch Ness really, when that mania around the monster really kicked off. It's because people watched King Kong and wanted to see those great unknown creatures living among them.
A recent expedition placed a high-speed camera underwater. A sonar device would trigger as the shutter on the camera recorded the passing of any large creature. The camera took these two pictures. Is this the fin of a plesiosaur?
Makili Mumembe, which is in, I think, the Congo, is another long-necked creature. These explorers brought a book to the Congo, opened it up, and the natives were like, oh, this long-necked thing looks like something we saw in the swamp. Could have been a rhinoceros they might have seen, who knows. But explorers immediately thought, there's a dinosaur.
Another unexplained creature is said to inhabit Lake Tele in the African Congo. Located 450 miles inside the smothering jungle, Lake Tele is largely unexplored. The natives say they've seen an animal that resembles a brontosaurus. In 1981, explorer Herman Regusters reported that the natives could identify pictures of an animal they called Mokili Mabembe.
These creatures inspired real-world myths and legends from film. And you probably wouldn't even make the connection between King Kong and Loch Ness, but there you go. And they were trying to capitalize on it. Son of Kong came out shortly after King Kong, and the film failed to really capture the same imaginations that the original did, because it's cheaper and not as good. But then, where does King Kong appears in Edo fit into this? Where does that come into play? Well, that's very different. For one, it's not about King Kong at all. It just has the name King Kong in the title. The film is actually a historical samurai film, and it was a silent film that was broken up into 2 parts. And it's about this criminal who kidnaps the daughter of this very rich man as an act of revenge, and also to make a ransom on the girl. Now, he does this by sending his pet ape, who is called Kong, who's called King Kong, he nicknames him, out to capture the girl. And King Kong in this was played by a human actor in makeup and, costumes, and it was essentially the first kaiju film Japan put out. It was a ripoff of King Kong to some extent, but also a very familiar story. It was a historical drama. It was a samurai film. Eventually, things spiral out of control, and the ape kills the rich man, but is himself killed. And the criminal guy gets away with everything and walks away a little bit richer. The girl gets saved. Happy ending all around for the most part. Well, not happy ending, but typical for a samurai story. Some of those stories are very depressing, might add. It's debatable whether or not the King Kong in this movie was a giant ape or could shapeshift and get bigger and smaller. Some claim the director was trying to just directly capitalize on King Kong entirely and release these fake production stills, because these production stills are some of the only things we have of the film today, where they have the ape and he's holding up the girl in his hand, and he's like a massive creature, maybe substantially bigger than King Kong in America. So people were for a while thinking, oh, maybe it's just faked for the film, maybe because the way it's written, it sounds like just a normal ape. But then there was an interview with Ryunosuke Kabayama, who was later known as Fuminori Ohashi. He helped create the effects of the ape in this film, and he would later go on to do the effects in Godzilla and Kamen Rider and many others. But in a 1988 interview, he clarified that he made a suit for a quote-unquote giant gorilla, which kind of leads into the fact that maybe King Kong was this giant kaiju that the criminal just happened to tame.
And does Kong change size? In some of these images, he seems to be the same size as a person, and other times he's giant. It's really weird.
That's about it for now, though. What happens is there's a big decade in the 40s where monster movies don't really show up a lot. I mean, there was the universal cycle of monsters, sure, but that's a bit of a big stretch. Mighty Joe Young, again. But the kaiju genre doesn't really take off in the 30s. It really takes off in the 50s, with the 30s kind of being sort of the foundational building blocks that would build to something bigger. In particular, Willis O'Brien, who during Mighty Joe Young was training his protege, Ray Harryhausen. And in the 50s, Ray Harryhausen really took off. And he took off in a big way, really fast. What's America afraid of in the 1950s? Well, they're afraid of atomic weapons. This is the atomic era. We're scared of nuclear radiation. We're scared of aliens coming from space, and we'll get to aliens later. They're just reoccurring throughout this whole story. The radiation, we believe, is going to cause animals that we're familiar with to get mutated in some fashion.
We're born in that swirling inferno of radioactive dust, where things so horrible, so terrifying, so hideous, there is no word to describe them.
We got the beginnings of a new genre of film, the sci-fi monster picture. And we get a lot of alien invasion stuff. We got Roger Corman coming in with all his cheap but effective matinee films, his B-movies. But I think The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms is what really kickstarted the 50s cycle of the giant monster movie.
In a state of suspended animation are the awesome creatures, and under certain conditions, a nuclear explosion could free one from his icy tomb.
Because we got some radiation films. We got the Quatermass Experiment. We got some alien films. We got Day the Earth Stood Still and the Pod People from Invasion of the Bystanders. But the thing was, they were all human scaled. They were not massive monsters like we got in The Beast of 20,000 Fathoms, because how are they going to do that? Well, turns out, stop motion. And I think Beast of 20,000 Fathoms is very interesting because this particular film laid the groundwork that Godzilla would later take. Godzilla is this massive success, but Beast of 20,000 Fathoms, it's a really good one-off film, but didn't really inspire a whole lot of sequels. It's based on the Ray Bradbury story called The Foghorn. And it's this moody and powerful movie about a giant dinosaur that's unlocked thanks to atomic testing. It's like frozen in the ice, and the atomic bombs go off and it frees this beast from beneath sheets of ice. It's a prehistoric creature of untold danger. But where does it differ from Godzilla? Because again, Godzilla is also about atomic testing, awakening up some ancient monster from beneath the surface of the earth. But it really differs in three key ways: the realism, the tone, and the resolution of the plot. Now, I'm not going to pretend that Beast from 20,000 Fathoms is a particularly realistic film. It's a movie about a dinosaur that's defrosted and goes on a rampage. It's pretty goofy. But what happens is the creature, which is a dinosaur called the Rhedosaurus, which I don't think is a real dinosaur at all, it swims from the Arctic to America. And it attacks buildings like lighthouses that it perceives as a threat. It attacks the vehicles. It feeds on humans, but it's not a fantasy creature. It functions like a real animal, so to speak. It's looking for its nesting grounds. It's looking for its home that's been, covered up by society. And it's actually funny. You watch the movie, the beast is actually following the roads. It's walking down the paths opened up to it. It's not smashing through every building. It's looking for the path of least resistance, like an animal might. Also, unlike Godzilla, bullets and explosions, you can blow it up. But there's a catch, because they actually figured out maybe instead of having it be indestructible, the reason you don't shoot at the Rhedosaurus is because its body is filled with prehistoric microbial life. That the bacteria living in the dinosaur, when released into the atmosphere, can cause a massive infectious wave. So they can't shoot the dinosaur because shooting it will lead it to bleed, and by bleeding it's going to maybe kickstart a pandemic or an epidemic of some kind. And because of that, they got to figure out new ways to stop it. They have to get creative with how they stop the dinosaur. And they do. They ultimately create a very unstable isotope, which they launch into the creature to give it radiation poisoning. Radiation is not so much the threat, it is the solution. It started the problem, but it also can solve the problem. Because after all, Godzilla is indestructible. Godzilla cannot be stopped by conventional means. You cannot blow up Godzilla. You cannot restrain Godzilla. You cannot, all your nukes, all your electric fences, all your artillery shells, it cannot stop Godzilla. Beast of 20,000 Fathoms? It can be stopped, but doing so hurts you in return. The military succeeds in one, but in the other, the cost of defeating Godzilla is far, far greater. The only way to stop Godzilla in the original 1954 film is by using a weapon known as the Oxygen Destroyer. The Oxygen Destroyer is a weapon stronger than the atomic bomb. It doesn't simply destroy buildings, create an explosive wave of force with radiation. It destroys all life in the surrounding area, period. Just gone. And the scientist who creates it is so horrified by the power of the Oxygen Destroyer that when he uses it only once to stop Godzilla, he cuts his lifeline and perishes with his weapon and with the threat it stopped, so that no one can recreate it or use it a second time. But unlike, say, Beast of 20,000 Fathoms, which ends on a note of the military won, humanity is saved thanks to great ingenuity, it ends with a warning that if we are not careful, we might awaken another Godzilla.
もし水爆実験が続けて行われるとしたら
And that the cycle of destruction will just happen again and again. That these weapons cannot be pushed further, lest you destroy everything. Whereas in America, radiation saves the day! Good old radiation.
Credit for this primeval specimen should go to Ray Harryhausen and Willis Cook, special and technical effects men who've rigged an awesome apparition, seemingly the size of the Paramount building, as destructive as a hydrogen bomb, and as incredible as, say, a Rhedosaurus. The script, on the other hand, is about as close to reality as King Kong, but despite more than a suspicion of palaver, it generates a fair portion of interest and climactic excitement as the beast, first reported by Paul Christian as a nuclear physicist who's understandably thought to be a mite daft by his associates, makes its way down from Baffin Bay to its original home, the deep's 150 miles off New York. Although a heap of questions remain unanswered and a lot more are wrapped in pseudoscientific jargon, the tremendous invader finally is killed with the help of a contingent of GIs armed with bazookas and a radioactive isotope.
This is the big difference. Beast 20,000 Fathoms is a movie about a problem that the military and scientists work together to solve. It's, in short, a film about society coming together to stop something gigantic and dangerous. Godzilla is a film about inevitability and death. You cannot stop Godzilla. You cannot rationalize with it. You cannot understand it. Death is coming, and even staving off nuclear Armageddon only means bringing worse evils into the world. And even then, even if you stop Godzilla, it does not end the threat of the monster. As we see in later films, of course, and this informs our read of the first Godzilla film, the Oxygen Destroyer does indeed bring about worse evils. Much later on in the film's continuity, yes, but this weapon, still we feel the ramifications of later on in later entries in the series. It should be noted, of course, that Harryhausen believed Godzilla to be a complete ripoff of the beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and until his passing day, called it just a cheap imitation of his creation. And I disagree. Yes, they are similar. They're both reptiles awakened by nuclear testing, but they're very different types of fears represented by the beasts. The Rhodosaurus is a complicated problem. Godzilla is an inevitable force, and I think that kind of draws the connection between where the West and the East kind of exist in the conversation of monsters. Kaiju are forces beyond our understanding. A giant monster is a beast we can destroy. We never see anything in The Beast of 20,000 Fathoms as disturbing as a mother cradling her children as they wait for death, or a choir of children singing as the dead, who themselves are irradiated, are buried in mass graves. Another thing you're probably wondering is, why did Japan use a man in a suit while Ray Harryhausen used stop-motion animation? Well, Harryhausen was trained in stop-motion, and in fact, Harryhausen was very selective about the projects he took from that point on, because he could only do like one every couple of years, because of how time-consuming stop-motion took. Whereas Toho, they could use stop-motion. In fact, they occasionally would use stop-motion in some of their films, but only for brief scenes, because the process was too expensive, it took too long, and a man in a suit could be filmed very easily. Just build a few miniatures, put the man in a suit there, walks around. The FX team at Toho could and did use stop motion, but they chose not to, and that decision allowed them to make a lot more Godzilla films a lot faster, and that in many ways is the key to Godzilla's longevity over time, because you could make more, you could pump out a lot, and the series could continue. Whereas Ray Harryhausen could do a few films a decade, Toho could pump out a few kaiju films a year, and other studios took note. Beast set the pattern for monsters in America. Either we found ancient evils trapped under the ground, or normal animals were twisted by science, or aliens. Again, aliens happen a lot. Them and Tarantula are movies about animals, insects and arachnids specifically, who are mutated by radiation, by animal experimentation, and become far larger versions of themselves. Now, I prefer them over Tarantula, mainly because you see the ants more, and the ants, while they may not be as realistic as the tarantula, are also physical things on set. They use miniatures, stop motion, puppetry, and it looks more convincing in relation with the camera and the other actors. You know, Tarantula, you look at that and go, it's a superimposed effect. I know what that is. But the ants in them, they feel like they're moving in the sets along with you. And even when they're clunky, even when they're goofy looking, there's something about that tangibility that really works for them so well. Also, you see the ants throughout the film. There are more of them, and they pose more of a constant threat. Whereas the tarantula is this lumbering thing across the wasteland, and you always see it coming closer and closer, but you never really see it interact with the other sets beyond a few short scenes. Honestly, with Tarantula, once Clint Eastwood comes with a napalm, that thing's toast. With them, there's a bunch of the ants, so it's not just one you got to destroy, it's hundreds. One mad scientist experimenting with one tarantula? Okay, that's one thing. But our own nuclear weapons, our radiation turning out to be the avenue through which monsters are created to attack us in return, there's more of a thematic idea there that I think Godzilla represents very well. That nuclear testing will eventually result in these monsters coming to attack us. That our weapons and science can be turned against us unwittingly. Whereas with Tarantula, it's kind of our choice to make a monster. At least the scientist's choice. It's more interesting when these creatures are the result of our unintended actions as opposed to our deliberate creations, at least at this stage in the game. Mind you, sometimes it would just be this ancient creature coming out to attack us. Like, it came from beneath the sea, which is, oh, hey, Harryhausen again. How about that? Which is a giant octopus that comes out to attack us. We know giant octopus exist.
Here's your villain. It would take an enormous number of those to disable a Navy submarine.
Or just one of enormous size.
There is some basis, again, in reality for creatures like the big octopus from It Came Beneath the Sea. I think one of my favorite monsters from this era, it's not a Harryhausen creature, it actually owes more to Japan than the American style of filmmaking, is the British film Gorgo. It's not a great film, it has flaws, but I think the idea of it is so interesting.
The headlines of the world blaze the fabulous story of this monster from another age, catapulted from some vast sub-ocean cavern by unprecedented volcanic action.
It focuses on fishermen who discover this weird large reptile, and hoping to make a quick buck, they parade it throughout London as an exhibit. It's like, what if the people found Godzilla, but they treated it like how they would find King Kong? They find this ancient lizard, but instead of attacking it or fighting it, they decide to make money off of it. Well, okay, it's all well and good, but as it turns out, what they found isn't really a giant monster, it's a giant monster's baby. And its mother knows where the baby is and is coming right for London to get her kid back. And it's great because it's playing with the idea that Britain is this colonist country. It does play with the idea of colonialization. That Britain goes to different places, takes what it wants, and tries to just assume it has complete command. It's the greatest culture of all, but it is humbled by Gorgo's arrival, by this great monster's arrival that destroys all of its landmarks, and I love it. Unfortunately, the British public did not love it.
A sad waste, not of talent, but of opportunity. Some of the effects are very convincing, but these are offset by the general tone of the film. It is a satire on monsters. Gorgo could have been a fine film. It could have preached motherly love, the vanity of humanity, mankind's true weakness, or it could have been purely terrifying. Unfortunately, it doesn't do anything.
And again, British critics at the time did not like the film, which meant that while we'd see a lot of New York getting destroyed and a lot of Tokyo getting destroyed, Big Ben does not get its again for a very long time. It's a cheesy film. The effects aren't great. The camera angles aren't always fascinating, but what it is it's fun. And I think the Brits had a tough time enjoying monster films where their landmarks got destroyed. I think to an extent. I think they took it a little too seriously. It's essentially a children's matinee film, but they tore into it in a way that seems very particularly strange. You had your chance and you rejected it, you cowards, to do more Gorgo films, is what I'm saying.
What you are about to see has never been seen before by human eyes.
It was a common idea in Western films that we would find these monsters and bring them back home. Oh hey, it's Ray Harryhausen again. We went to a valley, found dinosaurs, brought them back. And I think what's so interesting is that Japan took that idea too with King Kong vs. Godzilla. I mentioned before, it's a satire film. A TV station goes to not Skull Island to find King Kong, and Godzilla shows up, and you think, wow, wouldn't it be great if we took King Kong and dropped him in Godzilla's path, and then filmed it, and made a big spectacle of it, made a big sensation about it. And yeah, I should mention that JSDF is involved in this film, and they do bring King Kong over after drugging him, but the TV station, or rather the pharmaceutical company sponsoring the TV station, is pushing for the entire thing to be filmed, so the point stands the same. That's what the film is ultimately really about, and why the film is so compelling in its original Japanese script, whereas they kind of have hints of that in the American version, but it's toned down a lot, in favor of everyone's favorite thing, white men in suits talking about the monsters from a scientific perspective.
Godzilla has a brain about this size. He is sheer brute force, while Kong is a thinking animal.
Turning King Kong and Godzilla into problems rather than insurmountable forces of nature that you should not control. Oh, and they also liked aliens. America got 20 million miles to Earth in 1957. Oh, look, it's Harryhausen again. But Japan loves these aliens. You look at, say, King Ghidorah, one of the most iconic adversaries of Godzilla. It's an alien. It's a planetary destroyer coming to Earth. Shortly after that, you got all these aliens who come down and mind control people. Famously, the movie Destroy All Monsters features aliens taking control of Earth's monsters in an attempt to destroy the planet, with King Ghidorah kind of being the only one who's kind of given free will, because King Ghidorah is just a jerk like that. It's great stuff. Touching upon something that's very interesting that Japan did that American films did not. Most American monster films were one-offs. They ended and then didn't continue. America did introduce the idea of the monster mash, with the Universal monster films all reigning supreme, with Wolfman fighting Frankenstein, with Dracula and Wolfman fighting, etc. Abbott and Costello jumping in there. But we kind of dropped the ball when it came to our monsters. Whereas Japan, because they can make several films a year, ramped it up. And how do you keep the people interested? You pit other monsters together. Godzilla, Mothra, Rodan. They all started with solo films before kind of funneling into the Godzilla franchise. When Godzilla fighting Mothra was successful and King Kong was successful, Gamera showed up. Gamera was another kaiju film at the time that became this sort of franchise where Gamera would fight another strange, bizarre monster. Of course, Gamera was a friend to all children. Gamera was a very sympathetic monster, even in his first film. Same with Mothra. The monsters, even though they were these cosmic forces of power with untold abilities, audiences liked them and wanted to support them and see them survive, or see them thrive in some way. And like a good WWE wrestler, you had faces and you had some heels. But all this really started with Godzilla Raids Again, which introduced one of the first kaiju versus kaiju fights. And this follow-up to Godzilla tried to frame both Godzilla and Anguirus as these two opposing forces. But I think the problem is Anguirus just wasn't a good opponent for Godzilla. Not the same way that King Kong, Mothra, or King Ghidorah were his next three opponents. Once the trend started, however, you couldn't back off. Every film had to have more monsters, sometimes multiple monsters showing up. Godzilla has a son, and as I mentioned, you need faces and you need heels. Some of the monsters over time became more sympathetic. Godzilla, who again was the main marquee attraction, went from being this titan of horror to someone the audiences could like and support, and with each subsequent film, he became more humanized. He would talk with the other monsters and the Mothra fairies would translate.
Mothra says the Earth belongs to them as much as it does to man. Oh, Godzilla, what terrible language!
You had scenes where he did victory dances and did increasingly goofy things. You had him handshake Jet Jaguar, who's a very humanoid-looking robot, in order to go fight a giant cockroach and an alien chicken with a buzzsaw on his chest. It got more human as time went on in the 70s. Gamera was the friend to all children, and this alien space turtle who happened to love children and just really have their interests at heart, and so you knew that no matter what happened, Gamera would always stand up for kids, and kids love that stuff. Even when the films got deeply disturbing with the violence, kids always felt comfortable knowing Gamera was on their side, and that led to the longevity of the Gamera series. And America missed out on that. We really did miss out on giant monsters fighting. That's not to say we didn't have giant monsters fight, of course. In the movie 1 Million Years BC, oh hey, it's Ray Harryhausen again. You had the marquee Allosaurus versus Styracosaurus fight. That was the big marquee fight of the movie, and that was what it was marketed on. These two stop-motion creatures clashing. But what ended up happening is the special effects became used in a different fashion. Stop motion was such a timely and costly method that it became part of the course that the films had to be upscale films. If you can use stop motion, it better be a big picture. Jason and the Argonauts, Clash of the Titans, they became the films where Harryhausen put his efforts into. The Voyages of Sinbad, these films were what Harryhausen would channel his creative skills into. Movies like Jaws, Grizzly, Alligator, the creature feature replaced the giant monster, and often the creature was nature. Just maybe a slightly bigger alligator, not a building-sized alligator, but like one that could fit in the sewers and crash through and attack a wedding of a corrupt business official or whatever. The monster became a shark. Sharks exist. Sharks have been known to eat people. And so nature took the core focus. Orca was just Jaws one-upped, But it wasn't a giant orca, it was just a smart animal. One that could exist in real life. And I think that's where America really deviated off the course that Japan was following. In the 70s, giant monsters reigned supreme in Japan. But in America, we had to either tone down the monster to make it more believable to general audiences, or if we had giant monsters, they were in sci-fi fantasy spectacles. One of the best monsters, I think, of the 80s, in my opinion, is the sandworm in Dune. And that's a very inexpensive special effect by today's standards. It wasn't exactly a stunning special effect, but you look at the sandworm from Dune, it follows the laws of Jaws. You barely see the sandworm, and it's more impressionistic. You see the sand rise up. You see the worm rise up through the sand. Most of the effect is concealed and hidden from the audience. Monsters became more a process of implication rather than overt showing. And when you did see a monster, usually very small, like the Gremlins or what have you, or it was an unconvincing effect, like Q the Winged Serpent, which I think is one of the most underrated monster films of the 80s from America. But even then, even in Japan at the 70s, the tail end, monsters faded away. Godzilla fought Mechagodzilla twice, then he faded off. Gamera, his films kind of ran their course. You would get some interesting Toho films outside of those two. You know, you got like Frankenstein Conquers the World, The War of the Gargantuans, but they were very few and far between. Monsters kind of faded out of focus. Until Godzilla and Gamera showed back up. Godzilla 1985 was the start of the Heisei era of Godzilla films. It was an attempt to return to the original style of kaiju. Godzilla was the solo adversary. No more monster mashes for now until the next film, because, of course, he was a straight-up monster, a figure of terror. Dark, imposing, frightening. His design was different. He looked more like a monster than less like a friend to humanity. Because if you notice in the old Godzilla films, even Godzilla's head kind of shifted a little bit. Be more friendly, wide-eyed, expressive. This was expressive, but it only expressed 3 expressions. Hate, rage, and bloodlust. And there was nothing else going on with Godzilla. Even when he happened to be aligned with humanity's interests, it was always to conquer a new apex predator. It was not necessarily out of kindness for humanity. It was just, I have a new threat, I gotta fight it now. And even when they gave him a child again, like in the original films, it was more animalistic. Godzilla was at his most animalistic, I feel, in these films. You see his origin as a lost dinosaur and a lost civilization. Again, much like The Lost World. There's no chance for humanity to empathize. I think one of the greatest scenes in the Godzilla films of that era, it's seen in King Ghidorah versus Godzilla. And there's this Japanese soldier from World War II. Back in World War II, his life was saved by the Godzillasaurus, and he has this kind of kinship with Godzilla. He sees Godzilla as his protector, as someone who has saved him from disaster. They make eye contact through a window. And Godzilla just kills him. Doesn't even think about it, doesn't hesitate, just looks at the building and blows it up and smashes the building apart. This man puts so much emotional projection onto Godzilla. But when it comes down to it, Godzilla doesn't care. He's going through that building, he's going to take you out with it. Doesn't remember you, doesn't care about you. He's just going from point A to point B, and you're in his way. It truly captures the idea of how this Godzilla was very different from the original 60s and 70s Godzilla, or at least what that version of Godzilla became following the first film. Godzilla was a ruthless monster, and the only reason he sometimes aligned with us was to fight a threat to his claims. And again, I alluded to this before, but the Oxygen Destroyer from the first film then became the final threat Godzilla had to face, when we find out that the Oxygen Destroyer mutated life around Godzilla, resulting in this creature known as Destroya. And Destroya happens to be what eventually fights Godzilla to his end. You see, Godzilla is also a nuclear reactor. He is physically a nuclear reactor, and his body is starting to break down. So even if Godzilla was a friend to humanity, he'd still pose a threat to the human race by the very nature of his existence. Godzilla becomes a walking disaster, and that's really cool. Meanwhile, Gamera has arguably one of the greatest trilogy of kaiju films in history. Before, Gamera was kind of a little goofy in America. People didn't take him too seriously. And in Japan, he was the friend to all children, so kids media, basically. But this series of films, this trilogy, elevates Gamera to a whole new level. And it takes these elements of fantasy and imagination to a whole new level in a way that is compelling and existential and truly had some good emotional storytelling with the human characters and kind of tied all that in with the monster action. Great cinematography, great storytelling in general, some of the best kaiju films of the era. But what was America doing? Because most people, when they talk about monster films from the 90s, they're not talking about Japan. In fact, none of these films really aired in America for years. America stopped distributing new kaiju films from Japan. People found out that Godzilla died in Godzilla vs. Destroyer thanks to the news reporting on Japanese cinema.
But in his 22nd film, Godzilla vs. the Destroyer, to be released December 9th in Japan, the 42-year-old monster will finally meet his end. Godzilla will die. The film's directors promised the final scene will be unforgettable.
But no distributor was sending these films out, at least not at the time. That was much later. America was interested in a very different kind of film. The disaster movie. Twister really helped kick this into gear. And disaster movies were always a thing. Like, there was the Poseidon Adventure and all that, but Twister, and I think the films of Roland Emmerich, really brought the disaster film back to the forefront of society. But there was one film that came out that defined how monsters would be from here on out. And again, it kind of follows the train of what came before in the West. After all, it wasn't the first time dinosaurs helped motivate American filmmakers to make giant monster movies.
Boy, do I hate being right all the time.
Jurassic Park was at the time one of the most successful films to have ever come out. It was a massive hit, and we created special effects that genuinely were unbelievable. Stan Winston and his team created dinosaurs. They made dinosaurs thanks to puppetry and thanks to new CG animation.
Do you ever consider letting us do most of the full-size dinosaurs from head to toe on the computer? And my first reaction was, well, prove it. And he went out and he proved it.
But Jurassic Park looks great today because the effects were used sparingly and in conjunction with physical models. I mentioned before how them looked better today because it used actual physical monsters instead of like just superimposed spiders. And that's true. With the close-ups with the dinosaurs used giant puppets. The faraway shots used CG, and often the CG was obscured through shadow, through rain, through all that, in order to blend the physical and the technical effects together. Stan Winston's puppetry owes a big deal to all that success. And the films did end up going a little bit further into kaiju territory. Jurassic Park: The Lost World ends with them bringing a T-Rex back with them to San Diego. Again, you'd think they'd figure this as not a good idea at the time, but who knows? You know, the folly of man and all that. And T-Rex wrecks shop with San Diego. Unfortunately, San Diego is not as recognizable of a city as New York City or even Chicago or Hollywood, but hey, you still get to see a giant creature wreck up stuff. That really was what showed distributors, hey, we want to see more giant monsters. And we did get more giant monsters to an extent. Usually it was just mutated creatures. Again, like Lake Placid. There was a remake of Mighty Joe Young, which I think is really underrated personally. Deep Rising was this great deep sea monster movie with a terrific monster that, again, is underrated. While I have avoided discussing video games in this topic, I think one other case of cross-pollination of culture that's interesting is the case of Dino Crisis, a game that capitalized on the dinosaur craze from the West in a Japanese video game. Japanese studio Capcom reinvented their Resident Evil games as a dinosaur thriller, essentially. Dino Crisis remains one of the most beloved 90s survival horror games to come out, and features giant dinosaurs and small dinosaurs as threats. In this conversation, I think it's interesting because it showcases that Japan also did notice the success of Jurassic Park and tried to capitalize it in their own special way. This shows that it's not just a one-way streak with this giant monster story. When America comes up with a good idea, Japan will incorporate it. And in the case of Dino Crisis, really emphasize the sheer horror that dinosaurs present, while a lot of American-focused movies focused more on the destruction they could wrought. I think that the recent craze of analog horror involving dinosaurs is a case that maybe Dino Crisis was onto something that American studios were too afraid to engage in. I think, though, I want to focus on two different particular films. The remake of King Kong that Peter Jackson put out, and the remake of Godzilla. The remake of King Kong from the 2000s, not the 70s version, but the 2000s one, tried to make King Kong into a giant gorilla, a giant real creature, but they also had a lot of chances to emote with him, to emphasize the subtextual story in the original King Kong and make it full-blown text. Peter Jackson was a clear fan of King Kong. He tried to recreate some of the lost scenes of King Kong using the techniques that Willis O'Brien had at the time, and it was painstaking. I have problems with Peter Jackson's King Kong. I think it's too long. I think it's sometimes a little too emotional. I think some of the scenes just drag and drag and drag, but What is undeniable is Peter Jackson's passion for the story, his enthusiasm for this narrative, and the idea that he wants to humanize Kong in a way that's compelling and interesting. And then there's the 1998 Godzilla film by TriStar. It is bad in ways you might not realize. Godzilla went through several phases of development. At one point, it was going to be more in line with the original Japanese storytelling. This version of Godzilla that started production in 1994 was originally going to be directed by Jan de Bont. Jan de Bont is a Dutch director you probably know for Twister and Speed. So yeah, the guy had some talent. Sadly, after this movie, he did also make Speed 2, Cruise Control, and Lara Croft Tomb Raider, and The Haunting remake, but the guy had experience. Plus, previously, he worked on Roar, one of the most dangerous film sets ever produced. And again, both his early work with Roar and Speed and Twister kind of aligns him with the more natural, homegrown horror, the force of nature that comes with an irrational, destructive wave against society. In many ways, he was perfect for Godzilla in the 90s. Godzilla was designed by Stan Winston, the guy who made the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. And he made a miniature that looked a lot like Godzilla, just combined with the T-Rex puppetry he had mastered previously. And they had a script where Godzilla would be, again, a cosmic entity, kind of like what you see in the 2014 legendary Godzilla. He's this elder creature who is fighting a new threat that rises to mankind. In this case, a creature called the Griffin. As originally conceived, the Griffin was an alien piece of tech, essentially. It was a biological weapon that aliens sent to Earth to depopulate it in an attempt to colonize it. And the monster would mutate and change by absorbing and assimilating other creatures from Earth into its biological structure. In many ways, it was a perfect combination of the scientific advancements and alien fears that were prevalent in American media at the time. It's a great combination of both the aliens that would be popularized in stuff like Independence Day, as well as the Jurassic Park dinosaurs. And I think its design fits that. It's very much like a European monstrosity. Even its name, the Griffin, is a reference to European folklore. Yet at the same time, it feels perfectly in place with the sorts of monsters that you would see in the Heisei era of Godzilla films. You look at this creature and you can see it right alongside Biollante or Space Godzilla in terms of original monsters from this era. One reason why the Griffin was created was because Toho had a licensing deal where every individual monster had to be licensed individually. So while the original plan was to have King Ghidorah be the big bad, the Griffin just made more sense from a financial standpoint. You saw something similar with the Mutos in the 2014 Godzilla film later on. It felt very much like a good combination between the West and East, where Godzilla, this ancient force of nature, would confront a scientific mutation and monstrosity, an aberration. And it did feel like a good blending of the two styles. And then they brought in Roland Emmerich, the king of disaster movies, because the studio was afraid, oh, this new version of Godzilla with this Griffin and all that, the Stan Winston effects, it's gonna be too expensive. Let's bring in Roland Emmerich, who in fact further expanded the budget to create something that was heinous. And let's be perfectly blunt, Emmerich didn't like Godzilla. In fact, he hated everything about it.
We are living in a time when people have seen Jurassic Park and The Lost World, and we don't have the same kind of limitations the Japanese had when they made their Godzilla. There's an American movie called The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, shot in the early 1950s. This movie was done with stop animation and was one of Ray Harryhausen's best works. Obviously, the Japanese saw that movie and said, oh, we should do something like that too. But they had no clue how to do stop animation. They couldn't do stop motion animation. So they just built a big suit and put a stuntman in. And that's why it's so bottom heavy. That's why it looks a little bit silly. They built a big rubber suit, but a rubber suit was much bulkier because if it was too close to the human body, it gave away there was a person inside it. It had these big, fat legs and couldn't walk very fast. It developed this kind of Godzilla walk. Now with the new effects technology, we don't have that limitation, and it slims down the creature enormously.
He thought it was, he had contempt for the franchise from day one, and it shows in the final result. Is 1998's Godzilla a bad monster movie? Not necessarily. There are some good parts to it, but it's all stuff you've seen before done better by someone else. The entire last act of the film is basically just Jurassic Park in a city, complete with the velociraptors. But instead you have the baby Godzillas, and instead of like the lab, it's Madison Square Garden. But again, it's diminishing returns. The effects aren't as convincing, the monster action isn't as compelling, the characters who are being attacked aren't as dynamic, and thus you care less about what happens. And the big thing also is that the version of Godzilla in the movie Godzilla is not Godzilla. There is no god in this Zilla, it's just Zilla. The beast is taken down by explosives. Again, like the beast from 20,000 Fathoms. The big difference is, unlike that creature, which carried prehistoric contagions, this Godzilla just drops. At least we got the cartoon out of it, but it's just not enough. It's too little, too late. And coming into the 2000s, aside again from Peter Jackson's King Kong, the kaiju genre sort of petered out a little bit. Jurassic Park released its third entry, which in many ways is the most kaiju-like film in the series, where the dinosaurs are these colossal monsters. But it was also the least interesting because there was no humanity to ground these ideas. The film was a disappointment, and I think that kind of helped fade out the monsters. And even then, with Jurassic Park 4, there were plans apparently to make the dinosaurs humanoid hybrids. Again, moving further and further away from the kaiju action that we had started to begin to see. You know, people talk about like superhero fatigue, right? Well, Japan was going through kaiju fatigue. These films were coming out year after year after year, but they were not successful. Japanese audiences were actually more interested in foreign films than they were domestic films. In 2003, 15 of the top 20 grossing movies in Japan came from America. And of the 5 that weren't, 1 was Hero, a Chinese film, and 2 were anime. And one of those anime was Pokemon Jirachi Wishmaker, which just has a kaiju-ish scene in it, but I think it's successful because it's Pokemon, not because of the kaiju scene. Where did Godzilla rank? Well, the top grossing Godzilla film of that year, of 2023, was Godzilla Tokyo SOS, which ranked 69th that year. That's bad, but let me tell you what beat it, and it's going to be even worse. 32nd place, Spy Kids 3 Game Over. 37th place, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. 55th place, Dreamcatcher on its re-release. Oh, and 63rd, My Big Fat Greek Wedding. What Japanese audience is going to like My Big Fat Greek Wedding? I have no idea. But more Japanese people wanted to see My Big Fat Greek Wedding than they wanted to see all of the Godzilla films combined that year. Godzilla Final Wars was supposed to be the final send-off for Godzilla, which featured Godzilla triumphantly beating the snot out of Zilla. It was also one of the lowest grossing Godzilla films to date. In 2024, when Godzilla Final Wars came out, it ranked 75th in the Japanese box office, behind Devilman.
Devilman was such a bomb. People didn't just see it as a failure of a film, but the failure of the entire Japanese film industry. Someone hated this movie so much, they made a webpage to collect all the negative reviews. Now, that is the kind of I crave.
The live-action version of Devilman, commonly regarded to be one of the worst Japanese films ever created, outgrossed Final Wars. And yes, in case you're wondering, Pokemon and One Piece continually outgrossed Godzilla every single year. Oh, and you know what other film outgrossed Godzilla Final Wars? The Passion of the Christ. Why people in Japan wanted to see The Passion of the Christ, I have no idea. But it outgrossed that. But I will say this. Both Pokemon and One Piece demolished Passion of the Christ at the box office. So Pikachu, more popular than Jesus in Japan. And Luffy, same thing. But I think what happened was also that the market was steadily filling with superhero films. Spider-Man and X-Men were more popular than Godzilla and King Kong at this time. What did reignite interest, I think, was King Kong. King Kong really did spark a lot of interest in giant monsters, but 2 films I think really showed that the Japanese style of kaiju could be very successful. And those 2 films are Cloverfield and Pacific Rim. Cloverfield had an incredible marketing campaign. It was able to really push this enigma and mystery in a way that led audiences to question what's going on. Where's this film going? What's the idea of this film? The baby kaiju in the film is reminiscent in a lot of ways to Gorgo. It's a smaller monster who is awakened in the city and is throwing a temper tantrum, essentially, out of control. All of that, though, of course, is lore you didn't need to understand for the film to make sense. The film really focuses on human beings struggling in the face of a disaster. I remember watching it in theaters and going that this made me think of 9/11. And that wasn't uncommon for a lot of people in that time. 9/11 imagery was all over the place. And, as a guy from New Jersey, outside of New York, that imagery of New York being in ruin was very much like that period of time. It was a traumatic point in history that a lot of us was still fresh in our minds. So there was an audience for earnest storytelling in the face of destruction that could be taken seriously by audiences and critics alike. But Pacific Rim showed us that people sometimes just want to see a giant robot slam a monster across the face with a battleship. Guillermo del Toro really had his finger on the pulse for a lot of stuff that people wanted to see. People wanted to see women fall in love with fish people, and they wanted to see giant robots fight giant monsters. I mean, listen, Pacific Rim in a lot of ways is basically Evangelion, but minus the existential horror and with a lot less complicated psychology and a much more optimistic ending. But in many ways, it's also like Godzilla. You have the aliens who come down to Earth, or in this case, come up through the Earth with the portals they have under the sea, and send giant monsters to attack and invade humanity. And it's about mankind coming together to combat this outside alien force. It's a great, simple idea that's been done well before. Del Toro just made a pastiche of his favorite kaiju films and got a big budget behind it. And it worked, though not for the reasons that people expect. Pacific Rim domestically did not do that great, but it did fantastic overseas in China, Japan, etc. And that motivated studios to go, hey, maybe we can put more money into these giant monster films, which led to 2014's Godzilla remake. And this time, I think they really got something there. Yes, the film has problems. I think of the MonsterVerse films, it's my least favorite of them, but what works really works. Yeah, they killed off Bryan Cranston way too early. That's awful. Yeah, Aaron Taylor Johnson is not as compelling of a protagonist. And yes, they do conceal most of the monster action. I think kind of in a way that was reminiscent of Cloverfield, but unlike Cloverfield, where you're from the perspective of a human being in this disaster, we are not. We're just watching a movie, so it's not like, oh, we only have this limited lens of the action from the camera. It's no, we could see the monsters fighting, but we're choosing not to show it. You're choosing to wait for the final fight, which is admittedly a great fight. Godzilla is no longer a reptile. He's no longer a reawakened dinosaur. He is a cosmic force of nature. The atomic testing in Bikini Atoll, rather than what awakens Godzilla, was designed to destroy Godzilla, but it failed. Godzilla is far, far, far older here than ever before, and that really works. It brings this Lovecraftian component to kaiju that I think that differentiates the Legendary Universe from the rest of the kaiju stuff in a way that's really interesting and neat. I really love this sense of cosmic depth and threat. And it does go back to some of the sillier ideas of the Showa era. They get really silly, these films, but I love it. Everything builds up to Godzilla and King Kong fighting. Again, a remake of the classic battle, only this time it's not for a social satire, it's not as a WWE match necessarily, it's as a sense of existential need for these two apex predators from the west and the east to go and fight. But something had imperceptibly shifted. Something had changed. Something you couldn't even tell was going on until you thought about it after the fact. While all this was happening in America, Japan had brought back their giant monsters. And while a lot of people want to forget about the Japanese Godzilla anime trilogy, God knows I do, there was another film that came out that was substantial in the Godzilla landscape, Shin Godzilla. Shin Godzilla is, in my opinion, one of the best pieces of giant monster kaiju media in the last 15 years. Drawing heavily from the 2011 Fukushima disaster, Shin Godzilla is not a story so much about a giant monster, but more about the government's failure to respond to a giant monster. Yes, Shin Godzilla is a mutated monstrosity, but the real focus is on the absurdity of the government, on committee meetings and phone calls to dignitaries, all going on to decide what to do about that giant monster that's rampaging across the streets, or rather, crawling on its stomach across streets because it can't even lift itself up with its mutated, pathetic-looking arms. It's a story both about the abject horror of being a monster and the abject absurdity and inability of government to respond to disaster. In a lot of ways, it's remarkably similar to a Korean horror film made by Academy Award-winning director Bong Joon-ho, The Host. The Host is also about a mutated monster of her own creations attacking civilization. Though I'd make the argument that Shin Godzilla is more horrific of a monster, but The Host is far more pessimistic of a story, focusing on cover-ups and the refusal of government not only to do anything about a problem, but also how class inequality affects how different people are affected by these disasters. But Shin Godzilla is a fairly optimistic movie when all's said and done, assuming, of course, those Spawn children coming out of its tail don't go anywhere. I mean, Shin Godzilla was so optimistic it even got a crossover with Hideaki Anno, the director of Shin Godzilla's other more famous creation, which, as we all know, Evangelion is the most optimistic of all giant robot kaiju-esque things, right? There's nothing negative happens in Evangelion. Nope. No sirree. What are we talking about again? Oh, right, Godzilla. Come 2023, with the arrival of Godzilla -1, conversation shifted. Godzilla x Kong, that looks great, but it's never going to top Godzilla -1. And indeed, it couldn't. Godzilla -1 became what's widely seen as the best Godzilla film of the last, since the original. A lot of people love Godzilla -1. I don't know if I agree necessarily. I think Godzilla -1 is the best Godzilla film we've gotten since the original, but Shin Godzilla is the best depiction of Godzilla that we've gotten since the original, in my opinion anyway. But the film deals with so many great themes. It's a historical drama focused on the recovery of war, how war traumatizes countries, cultures, cities, individuals. The scars don't leave no matter how much time passes, but the only thing that can bring you forward is the sense of family you find in your grieving of what once was. It's about recovery and survival just as much as it's about collective pain. On the other hand, Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire is a great kaiju film. It's a movie where you get Godzilla catnapping in the Colosseum, while King Kong goes and finds his family and challenges this cartoonishly evil villain for control over a pack of giant apes, while said evil emperor guy, the Scar King, dominates the spirit of a ice dragon that he's enslaved since the last ice age. It's so much fun and so goofy. Also, Mothra shows up, and any movie that has Mothra in it is already something I love. It has Dan Stevens in his most sane role of 2024 as a kaiju dentist, and yet it did not top Godzilla -1. Godzilla -1 swept the award shows. It got every single award possible, except for the Best Foreign Picture at the Academy Awards. It won an Oscar, but it didn't win the Oscar for foreign films. It wasn't even nominated for Best Picture, despite it probably being the only award show not to give Godzilla -1 a nod for Best Picture. Kind of funny, isn't it? How that continues to be the case with the snobbery of critics against the kaiju, but I digress. But in many ways, culturally, the discussion had shifted. While the Academy won't recognize any kaiju film for anything other than its effects, audiences seem to feel differently. And critics, too, unanimously loved Godzilla -1. But even then, the critical consensus was that Godzilla -1 was exceptional for a Godzilla film. The point I want to draw to is that the common audience is now shifting their perspective. Whereas before, in the history of this discussion, the Western kaiju film would be celebrated while the Eastern kaiju film was ignored, it's inverted. The MonsterVerse has been very successful across international borders, but there is a sense of snobbery with it, dismissing it as just standard kaiju affairs, while the real stuff is coming out of Japan. And what I don't like is that's the same snobbery that was dealt for the Japanese kaiju film for years previously. A lot of these older kaiju films, when they came out, they were disposable entertainment. Entertainment that was to be treated like something you can have fun with on a matinee on Saturday and then forget about just as soon after. But somewhere along the lines between the Mystery Science Theater 3000 reruns and sci-fi airings of these shows and USA Network showing these shows late at night, we started seeing these films that we've discussed from, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms all the way up to The Host as classics, as masterpieces of cinema. Or at least things that we could revere, things we show our kids, things we talk about years later. Part of a giant narrative of cinema, of the monster film. But when they first came out, these were just spectacle first. I don't know how many Godzilla films were made with the director consciously thinking, I want to tell a message right now. A lot of them were made just for the audience. A lot of the American kaiju films, Beast 20,000 Fathoms, same thing. I don't think it was commentary on wartime America or our perspectives in relation to the Red Scare, in relations to nuclear Armageddon, what have you. I just know it reflects those ideas because it was made in a time where these were topics of discussion. It's hard to really look at this objectively. These films were made for general audiences, but now we look back on them fondly. We look back at them with a greater sense of what these films might have meant at the time they were made. But now we look at these modern films and go, well, these new ones that did the exact same thing these old films we treat as classics did the same thing, they're not as good. They're no longer worthy of respect. But these other films that are obviously well crafted from Japan, that are these masterpieces and really, really thoughtful, made with these auteur directors, these are the classics, everything else is garbage. It's the same snobbery that we dealt with the old stuff, what we saw the old stuff with.
Godzilla is so popular that a lot of people didn't even know that it originated in Japan, or that it's in the public domain in the United States, since Toho, the company that created Godzilla, never expected the freak lizard to get Marvelized one day. So they didn't renew and manipulate the copyright system like a certain company that does with all their beloved IPs.
It's amazing. You are 100% wrong. I mean, nothing you've said has been right.
Japan has released a new Godzilla film starring Eminem's hit album Kamikaze, and in the States, Godzilla is now collaborating with King Kong in what looks to be a brand new Fortnite event.
You! Shut up! You! Keep talking.
And look, here's the problem I have. I'm kind of annoyed by the snobbery that we have today. Because it's the same snobbery that infuriated me when I was a kid. It's just now it's been adopted by the fans of the genre that we've been talking about. Back in the day, fans loved all this stuff. All of it. Because it was just such bombast. It was a way to have fun on a weekday. It was a way to enjoy a good movie. And maybe they weren't all the best filmed, but they all had giant monsters. And that was fun. You got to see buildings getting ripped apart. You got to see these deeper ideas about humanity juxtaposed on these larger-than-life creatures. And what deeply bothers me, is that we've kind of dismissed one country's output for another's. We just keep trading back and forth. We can't look at these two things and say, oh, hey, these are two separate countries making their art for us to consume. We just go, okay, one's better than the other, choose which one's better. And I don't like that. I think that if we're going to look at this East versus West discussion, we got to look at two things. One, that these two sides of the same conversation have been pitted against each other by critics and by movie personalities and by the snobbery that we have towards whatever bias we may have at that time. And also go, they're all great films. They're all interesting. They all do something unique and cool. I hope this whole time I've demonstrated that it's not like one country was better than the other. They're both great. Yes, I do have a versus comparison, sure. And you can make the conclusion yourself, which country had the better ideas, and which was it Godzilla and Gamera that you preferred, or was it Jurassic Park and The Lost World and all those dinosaur movies that you liked? But it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Both countries can do better and have done better in the past and present. But equally so, we can do better as fans, celebrating, uplifting, and eventually drawing from both disciplines to make something special ourselves. Because like all media, the creators of tomorrow are born today. If you are a young filmmaker, and I've been seeing increasingly more people who have been making kaiju stuff, draw from both disciplines. Today, it's easier than ever to create kaiju media with easy to access CG models, with animation. I've seen some incredible pieces of media about kaiju recently. From American analog horror pastiches of Jurassic Park, to recontextualize histories of kaijus, to these bizarre, unusual animations. There's one called Godzilla Bloodbath, which I think is particularly bizarre. Really draws from the Shin Godzilla school of thought to make Godzilla more twisted and grotesque than ever. What it all comes down to is this. All of this is beloved. What I want you to do in the comments, if you've watched this far, tell me your favorite kaiju thing. Right now. Just write it down in the comments. Think about it. They come from the west, come from the east. Does it matter? Because when I said kaiju things, you probably thought an overlap of the two. People have been trying to make the great kaiju media, but I think today we're seeing more horror implemented in kaiju media than ever before. More sense of fear, of dread. We got another Jurassic Park film coming out this summer. We got another Godzilla film probably coming out shortly thereafter. There is more to come. We are not past the peak of this genre. And while there might be dips and valleys, never forget that whenever people have thought that the genre is played out, that we're done with it, it's always come back. Be that change. If you're a young filmmaker, young storyteller, make the next great kaiju piece of media and let me know about it, because I want to be there when you make it. That stuff is exciting. But don't treat the genre like it's one country's only. The history of the kaiju film is the history of film. Every single perspective, every single industry has taken their own stamp on the matter and drawn it in a different direction. Take that. Be a part of it. Don't pit filmmaker against filmmaker based on national boundaries. Because at the end of the day, what everyone wants to do is they want to make media that's good and fun and entertaining. At the end of the day, it's the only thing they want to do. Let's not act with a snobbish approach. Let's not be Roger Ebert dismissing Godzilla while praising King Kong, even though they're both great films. Let's not put a film down for something arbitrary. Let's raise both up for what they are. When watching a film, always ask yourself, what is the director trying to do? What is the writer trying to do? And do they accomplish it? Godzilla x Kong, Godzilla Minus One, they both are trying to do different things, and they both, in my honest opinion, succeed at what they're trying to do fantastically. But they're trying to achieve very different things. Accept that and embrace it. Don't fight it. Don't try to hold everything up to the standard of the one but not the other. Embrace every facet of this conversation and hold it up high.
This is a bad movie, but it has earned it... I can't even say this because I don't fucking believe it.
The tremendous invader finally is killed with the help of a contingent of GIs armed with bazookas. Bazookas? What the fuck? What's a bazooka?
This is a bad movie, but it has earned its place in history, and the enduring popularity of Godzilla and other monsters shows that it struck a chord. This is stupid. This is fucking dumb.
The tremendous invader finally is killed with the help of a contingent of GIs armed with bazookas, Kennedy. They are bazookas. You can do it. You've said this word.
All right. Hopefully one of those works. If not, let me. I can re-record it for you. But God, I'm really excited for this. These are terrible lines. I hate reading these. I love original Godzilla so much. I hated reading this. Good luck with the video.